Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar today. My name is Caitlin Clifford on the product marketing team here at Lookout. It's my honor today to introduce Phil Otchmuth. He is the program director on IDC's enterprise mobility team. His research provides insights into how enterprises deploy mobile devices and applications, as well as management and security platforms. Key markets he covers include enterprise mobility management, also known as EMM, and enterprise mobility security, including mobile data and threat protection and mobile device security technologies. Before I pass the ball to Phil today, I would just like to throw out to the audience that we will be launching a live poll throughout the next hour. Feel free to submit your answers as we chat through. Without any further ado, I'd like to pass the ball to Phil.
I'm Phil Otchmuth, Program Director for Enterprise Mobility at IDC. Today we're going to go over mobile threat management, addressing endpoint security's biggest blind spot. So a quick overview of the agenda. We'll try to get through as much as we can, but the first thing we'll talk about is kind of the changing nature of the enterprise end user computing space. Hint, it's going mobile. We're going to see the changes in sort of endpoint solutions, how people are adopting more mobile devices over PC, and some of the trends in that space. Then we'll talk about the enterprise mobility spending priorities. This is some data based on our most recent enterprise survey of IT decision makers. What are their top priorities in spending around mobile technologies, and what are their biggest perceptions of need from that perspective? We'll talk about mobile threats. What are the perceived and actual mobile threats that enterprises are experiencing with their smartphone users? We'll talk about the PC mobile security spending gap. This is kind of an interesting thing to see about how the reality of spending in terms of what people are actually deploying and using in terms of mobile security versus their plans and intentions, the divide between those two areas. We'll talk about mobile threat management as a technology, how we define it, what it is, what it does, and what are the adoption trends there, and then we'll close it off with conclusions, recommendations, and Q&A. So that's to give you a quick overview of what we'll talk about. So this first slide depicts kind of what's been happening in enterprise end user computing over the last several years. And everyone knows mobility is hot and it's really starting to come on a lot in the enterprise. But the reality is it's really, the switch was flipped really about 6 years ago. That's when we saw for the first time business smartphones eclipse business PCs in terms of shipments and adoption in businesses and for business use. And we've kind of been going along this trajectory ever since then. And what's driving this are a number of things. Mobile itself is becoming a primary platform for a lot of applications, business applications, email, collaboration, productivity. A lot of IDC data shows that people are really starting to look to the smartphone as their primary interface for a lot of these traditionally PC-oriented business technologies. And then also another trend we're seeing there is the emergence of just more devices being introduced into the enterprise for specialty use cases or specific use cases. We call it COSU, or corporate-owned single-use, where a smartphone may be deployed as a barcode scanner in retail, as a POS machine. If you probably had your card swiped in an iPad before, that's the kind of situation. So it's not just a sort of a one-to-one emergence of smartphones to employees, but many to one, in that there's probably 2 or 3 mobile devices in an enterprise now compared to a user. So that ratio we see growing more and more as just as more enterprises go down the route of digital transformation, moving to more mobile type technology in that space. And to drill down a little bit deeper into this, one of our survey questions was around, are you considering replacing traditional PC laptop use cases with mobile over the next several years? And a large percentage are saying yes, or 60%. 20% have already done this to some extent, and 60% say they'll be doing this or in trials to do this right now over the next several years. Some of the drivers there, why people are looking to mobile platforms as opposed to PC, obviously around mobility. You can walk around and use a mobile device with more flexibility from that standpoint. Increased productivity, we talked about the shift of productivity apps to mobile, people using those devices as primary interfaces for those. And then security, which I think is a really interesting higher up priority there. The perception that the mobile operating systems, the devices themselves, are actually more secure than a PC operating system, a PC device. It's an interesting notion. We'll definitely drill more down into that further on. But as you can see, definitely more a shift to that mobile-centric view of productivity, of workforce, and of just the proliferation of mobile devices in more use cases. So in terms of mobile spending priorities, we see security really topping the whole area. In terms of, if you cut off the top bar is security. That's the number one spending priority. 50% of organizations in our survey said that this was top of mind to them. And it's interesting, it really eclipses all other types of challenges that you might see in the enterprise. Integration challenges, the use of mobile EMM platforms, all other technologies are really kind of second place or third place to security from that standpoint. And again, I think a lot of this is being driven by the increased sophistication of mobile use cases. So people using mobile beyond just email and calendar, they're using real business apps, and sensitive data is being moved down to these devices. And in terms of the devices themselves, we asked IT buyers, what are your top priorities or top concerns, or what do you focus on when selecting mobile device technology? And strong security, overwhelmingly a priority there. Obviously, this is a IT-centric view of smartphones. If this was a consumer survey, you'd probably see, it flipped to some extent, affordability, battery life, features, but from a business perspective and how businesses want to deploy mobility, security tops all other, really all other functions or aspects of the devices. So in terms of challenges organizations are seeing in terms of enterprise mobility, security, again, rises to the top. You see a theme here, right? Compliance and security issues are the most cited challenge that enterprises said they faced or experienced when deploying mobile technologies. So that's not just devices, but also platforms, applications, the whole scope of mobile technology. So really the challenge I think the big challenges underlying there are around data security, governance, identity access control, things like that. There's a lot of things that flow down from security and compliance issues. But if you look at all the other issues too that organizations are facing from a mobile perspective, integration, OS control, lack of IT resources, project scope, all of these can also be sort of seen as security challenges as well, particularly OS version control. We'll talk a little bit about that in a few slides. But again, kind of security kind of being a thread, common theme throughout all of the responses and sort of the top of mind issue that we're really seeing from a lot of enterprises. So this slide shows what's going on, particularly with Android, which is kind of an interesting story in the enterprise. I think when Android first came out and when the iPhone came out and over that time period and smartphone and BYOD were starting to ramp up, Android wasn't probably considered a real business class platform, but just in the last year, we've seen a real explosion in Android devices in the enterprise. Obviously, from a BYO perspective, people adopting the technology more and bringing it into the workplace, but also from a corporate liable standpoint, a corporate deployed standpoint. So think about organizations that want to deploy tablets or smartphones in single-use case scenarios. They're probably not going to go for a very expensive device for that. So often they'll turn to maybe this platform to do that. So seeing that really erupt over the last several years, and there's just a mass adoption of Android in the enterprise. The challenge there is that Android, the ecosystem itself, is somewhat fragmented, right? I mean, you see a lot of different types of Android out in the wild. If you look at, and these are stats actually right from Google, over half of the devices running Android in the world, and these aren't just business devices, these are all devices, but it gives you a sense of sort of the state of the ecosystem. Half of the devices in the ecosystem are running versions of Android that are about 3 years old, or 2 versions prior to the most recent Oreo builds. So the more older operating system platforms that are out there, the more vulnerabilities. It's something to think about from an enterprise perspective standpoint. The real takeaway here is that mobile device OS fragmentation, it's never really going to be fixed. It's a reality that organizations are really going to have to learn to live with and manage and think about when they're thinking about the security technologies they deploy, the enterprise mobility management technologies they deploy to support mobility. These are the top perceived threats for enterprise mobility that we see from our survey data. And it's an interesting mix of things here. And we'll actually have some input from Lookout on this one too. But Wi-Fi or suspicious Wi-Fi is kind of a top perceived threat by many enterprise decision makers. And it makes sense. I mean, you have a large organization of end users who are traveling with traditional mobile workers and knowledge workers. They're traveling. They're going to airports, cafes, public hotspots. They're connecting to Wi-Fi. The devices themselves are really engineered to find Wi-Fi and really connect to it as quickly as possible. So there's the underlying fear that organizations are looking to that organizations need to secure that because they're worried about snooping or potential interceptions of traffic, man-in-the-middle attacks. These are called. So that's an underlying perceived threat. Number two on the threat sort of perception list is malicious messaging. So phishing, malicious SMS. This is a real issue that we started to see come on in the last several years. Actually, just in the last year or two, really. The issue around malicious files being sent over iMessage, or text, SMS, but also phishing as well. If you think about the screen real estate that you have for a mobile device, and in particular with the email app, you think about how easy it is to phish someone on a PC to some extent. People are trained in how to recognize that kind of thing. That training doesn't necessarily translate into a mobile UX. So we're starting to see more of a shift in terms of attackers' focus on mobile phishing, getting people to click and swipe on malicious messages, but also in other channels too, like we said, SMS and that type of thing. And then the third issue that many organizations are really worried about is the apps themselves. And these could be malicious mobile apps, basically mobile malware that's just put into an app store or loaded onto a device, or bad behavior of applications, which is actually a more prominent problem. So applications that are doing things in the background, doing things that an enterprise may not necessarily want to have happen on a business device, downloading contacts, contacting servers in other countries, information exchanges that are going on in the background with an app that are kind of unseen but sort of unwanted. That's a big worry for many enterprises. And to get back to the Wi-Fi build there is a little bit of reality check there, and I think this perception reality, this is where you kind of see some of the differences. And I think, Caitlin, I think there was some Lookout data on this.
Yeah, we completely agree with this. According to our own spectrum of risk research, we have found that over the last year, fewer than 10 in 1,000, so 0.8% enterprise devices encountered a man-in-the-middle attacks.
Yeah, so that's an interesting stat, and it kind of shines a little bit of a light on sort of perceived threats versus reality in terms of what organizations are saying. Yeah, so so on the next slide, we have a little bit more data on the issues that enterprises are facing, and some of it's a little bit muddled here, but really the top issues, we talked about network, mobile phishing, malicious applications, but if you were to sort of add together the malicious phishing and SMS as challenges, that would actually add up to be the biggest challenge over all the other ones. So if you think about sort of what the real threats are versus what the perceived threats are, bit of a difference there. The other challenge with, I think, mobile malicious message, malicious, it's a mouthful, right? The challenge of phishing, malicious SMS, that type of thing, is that a lot of it also kind of goes underreported or unrecognized by end users. They may be getting these messages either in their email app or on their texting or messaging app, not really knowing that they're under attack or that they're the target of an attack. So it's definitely something that has sort of emerged rapidly over the last several years. And I think, Caitlin, you had a stat too on that one, right?
Yeah, again, here it's pretty astonishing. Our own research team has discovered that the rate at which phishing URLs are being tapped on mobile devices is growing by 85% per year, and 56% of users received and tapped phishing URLs on their mobile devices. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah, I agree. So, and one thing to keep in mind here, at least according to the IDC research, is that there isn't really one platform that's more susceptible to any of these types of attacks than others. If you look at, according to our data, if you look at Android only or Android heavy organizations versus iOS only or iOS heavy organizations in terms of usage trends, the stats really kind of come out very similar. There's no overwhelming switch or difference in terms of experienced mobile incidents or security issues between those platforms. That's something to keep in mind. I know we called out Android a little bit earlier, but it's a cross-platform issue that I think most organizations are seeing to some extent. So here we kind of get into more of that perception versus reality kind of issue. So if you think about the way PCs are deployed or have been deployed in the enterprise over the last several years, really I think for decades now, mobile security technology has always been there. It's always you really don't. It's really almost unconscionable to think of, and certainly as an IT person, of deploying a fleet of PCs, laptops to an end user population without some kind of antivirus, anti-malware, advanced threat technology added on to the deployment. So that's really become an industry standard way to run and manage end user computing environments. There's really no assumption that the devices coming from the OEM will have inherent security. The spending on this is interesting in that you may have one agent or multiple agents on a PC doing any one number of functions, from just anti-malware scanning to advanced threat protection, data loss prevention. So there's a whole litany of functions and capabilities that people are adding on to the PC. To the right side, the mobile operating system, many organizations have really just kind of deployed these platforms without any real add-on security, save maybe an MDM platform or some back-end management platform for configuration. And it's kind of it goes back to the data point we saw earlier, the assumption that I think it was one of the top drivers for mobility and moving to mobile devices was an assumed level of greater security. But if you see in the next slide, the differences are pretty stark in terms of how people are investing in security relative to sort of the direction of end user computing usage in the enterprise. If you look at mobile or PC security spending, you see a huge gap of almost $40 spent per PC deployed in the enterprise on security software on average. So obviously some organizations spend a lot more, some spend less, but averaging this out, this is what we're seeing from there. On the mobile side, it's really pennies per device, 16 cents per mobile device if you were to look at all devices deployed and shipped in the industry versus the entire security spending for mobile security in the market. So as we saw earlier, a lot of organizations saying security is important, they realize it's important, they plan to invest more, but just until the recent past, they haven't really been investing there probably as much as they should. So this slide gives you kind of an overview of the different deployment models that we're seeing in enterprises, specifically for mobile, and it's pretty varied. And it gives you a view of kind of the challenges enterprises have had in getting mobile security out and deployed on devices. In that many organizations that have large BYO populations struggle to, first of all, even get the devices under management. So getting them enrolled and controlled in an EMM MDM platform has been challenged because of end user pushback. They don't want, obviously they want to use their phone for work. They want to access email and apps and things like that, but they don't want security on it. They don't want management on it. There's a perception of kind of privacy intrusion there. So that's been a challenge over a while, but also emerging different models of usage. How do you secure all of these? I think that's been a challenge for a long time for many enterprises. I think one of the major issues, though, is that there's starting to be a realization that ownership models need to be a little bit more shifted back to the company if they want to impose security. So if you look at sort of the planning stage, the states of planning for each of these deployment models over the next maybe 12 months, you actually see increased interest in corporate liable, increased interest in choose your own device, which is a model where an organization will actually still own and deploy the device, but they give end users a choice. They can say, hey, you can use this model, you can use this operating system, but the device still belongs to the company. So shifting to those kinds of models, I think, is a good first step for a lot of organizations to get to a more secure state from a mobile perspective. Other sort of plans that organizations have, device as a service. This is a kind of an emerging use case where you kind of rent the device as a service. It's good for companies that want to sort of upgrade frequently and really not have capital outlay for buying lots of devices. Again, that's a business, that's an IT-centric ownership model for mobility, which gives the opportunity to push more security management and control down to those endpoints. So kind of on that vein of returning to corporate liable devices, why are organizations looking to move in this direction? Obviously, top rated answer here is greater control over the devices, consistency across the devices. So we talked about that fragmentation issue of operating systems, different variants, different levels of patching and security. If that type of updating is left to the end user, to their own device, it's not as a reliable model. So organizations really looking to kind of push into that area. And I think a lot of this is really being driven by that, back to that earlier notion that obviously more devices in the enterprise are emerging, but also the use cases are just getting more diverse, and all of the use cases associated with B2B or enterprise really involve sensitive data or sensitive transactions being moved down to the endpoint, to these mobile endpoints. So there's I think a realization over the last couple of years that if organizations, beyond just enabling access to email and basic applications on mobile to mobile workers, whether it's BYO or corporate liable, if they want to get serious about mobility, if they want to move industry-specific apps to tablets and smartphones, if they want to sort of change the way they do business in terms of workflows and things like that from a mobile perspective, the ownership model has to change, and there has to be more security management and control pushed down to the devices in this model. In some ways, it reflects what had happened in the PC security and management space over the last several years. We're now kind of starting to see that emerge in the mobile space. So I want to talk a little bit now about mobile threat management, the technology, the market itself. This is how IDC defines it. This is right out of our security report that you'll actually have access to an excerpt of this at the end. A link will be provided to get access to this report. So the way we define this market, it's software that identifies vulnerabilities and malicious code on mobile devices, as well as active attacks and exploits, and mitigates these attacks. So basically, software that's protecting mobile devices actively, either on the device or delivered as a SaaS technology or solution. So the delivery models can vary, but it's really focused on device level activities. And it kind of breaks down to three main pillars of security technology. Protecting the device itself, the underlying operating system, the device componentry, that type of thing from attack. The apps and data, so applying security scanning, security policy enforcement, and detection to malicious apps, malicious activity on the device. We talked about mobile phishing, mobile SMS, malicious SMS, that type of thing. Really trying to monitor, secure, control that whole space. And then the third kind of pillar, I think, of MTM is around the network security. So we talked about whether or not how severe a threat that is, but it is something enterprises want, and they want to be able to have the ability to control and monitor and make sure that end users are connecting to safe networks. So this is the market. This is sort of the emerging technology that we're seeing here. And we'll talk in the next slide about kind of the adoption trends we're starting to see across some of these technologies. So managed devices. This is the emergence of devices in the enterprise being managed by an EMM or MDM platform. And as a whole, the market it's a somewhat maturing market. If you kind of look at some IDC data there, over 60% of organizations have an EMM in place. From a corporate liable perspective, if the devices are owned by an organization, the attach rate of those devices to an EMM is over 66%. So if the devices are attached to EMM and enrolled, they're most likely corporate liable devices. And one of the trends we're seeing here is that organizations that have corporate liable devices with EMM attached are also much more likely to deploy a mobile threat or mobile security agent or some software on the device itself, kind of in concert or with the EMM as sort of a 1-2 punch to security. So we see EMM, we see MTM, the affinity between those two technologies, and EMM really kind of being the conduit to getting more devices, not only more secure from a management perspective, but being able to deliver specific security technologies to those endpoints. EMM is kind of the best route to get that done in the enterprise. And I think what we're seeing, in a way, a lot of what we've talked about throughout this presentation has been kind of an evolution of mobility, starting to reflect what had been done in traditional computing and network infrastructure over time, the concept of defense in depth, whereas you have multiple security technologies throughout your organization, your architecture. You have firewall, you have IPS, you have endpoint security. We're starting to see now this evolve in mobility to some extent, where people are realizing, and they've had it for years, EMM, MDM technologies, they're really not security technologies underlying at the end of the day. They're management platforms. And I think organizations are starting to realize that just EMM itself is not enough from a security, compliance, and sort of peace of mind standpoint. So that whole connection of EMM to MTM, I think it's kind of an evolution of the whole defense in depth idea into mobility. And I think we're going to see that sort of going forward. So to wrap up the formal presentation, we'll just give a couple conclusions, recommendations here. Mobile security, obviously, from all the data we saw, it's top of mind. It is what organizations are thinking about, planning for, and really looking to do more of down the line from an end user computing perspective. They're looking to build out their mobile architectures. They're looking to mobility as part of a digital transformation strategy, I think. How can we go from paper clipboards to tablets? How can we go from deploying analog processes to digital? A lot of the times a mobile device is a key component of that. If you think about workflows across a lot of different industries, manufacturing, retail we've made a lot of retail examples here, but it's a pretty good one. So people thinking about enterprise mobility, enterprise security, what do they need to do down the line? Obviously that's a trend. But then we kind of get to that PC mobility security gap, and it's a real thing. And if you look at where people actually are spending their money, what they're investing in, the reality really hasn't caught up with kind of the ambition, I think, of mobile security and mobile deployment. So that's something organizations are starting now to address. It's going to take time to get there. It's going to take time to sort of realize where are the most important threats to be addressed, what are the use cases that require the most scrutiny from a management, monitoring, security standpoint. Obviously, not every activity on a mobile device needs, the utmost secure scrutiny in terms of, monitoring or security technologies, basic mobile computing apps, things like that. But if you're talking about, deploying your entire retail organization, moving to iPad-based, iOS-based cash register, POS, that's an issue. If you think about, suddenly deploying or replacing barcode scanners throughout an entire manufacturing organization with mobile devices, smartphones, you think about the implications of that from a security perspective. Tons of very secure, very sensitive information transacting mobile devices over the future. Many banks now thinking about deploying mobile devices as ATM or as customer service solutions. Again, that's where I think the scrutiny will be, the spending will be, the security focus should be over the next several years. And we talked about how businesses are starting to address this, and I think it comes down to kind of the realization that the architectures that happened in the past, defense in depth, multiple layers of security, the old belt and suspenders idea around security, that needs to come to mobility. So EMM alone or MDM alone or the underlying, or more importantly, assuming that the underlying mobile OS safeguards are enough to secure your mobile architecture, it's not really going to cut it. Organizations, they need to focus on mobile threat management tools that address the emerging attacks, the attacks that matter, the ones that are actually happening, which are mobile phishing, SMS. We talked about some of those challenges that organizations are seeing. And then kind of the final point here is that whole notion of, again, defense in depth, EMM and MTM kind of coming together, really being, I think, the way that a lot of organizations are starting to think about how to securely deploy, manage, monitor, and more importantly, react to and mitigate the emerging mobile threats that they're starting to see. MTM on its own, being able to detect, alert, find problems on a device is one thing, but mitigating it, trying to disconnect a device from a corporate network, or locking it, or shutting it down, or wiping, that takes kind of coordination between those two types of platforms. So I think organizations are starting now to see the value in tying these technologies together and really allowing them to be kind of that 1-2 punch for mobile security. So that's kind of the end of my formal presentation. I think we're going to take some questions.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. I would like to open it up to Q&A, but as you've been talking, I have a few questions already for you, so I'll just kick that off. The first one being, you have showcased security as being the main driver in mobile device decisions, and in one of your many proof points covered here today, we see businesses looking to replace laptops and PCs with mobile devices. Yet the PC versus mobile security spending gap is still so persistent. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with several things. I think organizationally, in a lot of IT organizations and enterprises, there's always been kind of separate teams, right? You have PC deployment teams, PC management teams, end user computing teams that really are focused on kind of the whole life cycle of Windows deployment, management, and security. And then you had kind of a different group of IT professionals responsible for phones, right? You're the phone people, and they're the ones who got you your BlackBerry, or as you moved down the line and things matured, iPhones, or the ones who had handled the influx of BYOD when that happened, over the last several years. So I think part of the issue has been kind of disparate buying centers and kind of a disconnected approach to really endpoint management, or lack of unified endpoint management in the market has been kind of the biggest challenge. So, we talked about that gap between, what goes on a corporate laptop when it's deployed versus what goes on a corporate phone, or even a BYO phone when it's deployed. The disparity in security software that's deployed is big. That has a lot to do with it. Those two different buying centers, and also I think to some extent, I think the mobile market, it really hasn't had its major security event, I think, whereas, we've had so many of those over the last decades, really, of Windows using business, and just Windows, PC usage in general. Hackers have always, the most target-rich or potentially lucrative targets, and the PC has been that for many, many years. The fact that we haven't seen a major exploit or front page type crippling mobile security event, I think doesn't mean that these things won't happen, or that they're slowly not happening but not people noticing it. Over time, I think organizations, what they want to do is kind of get ahead of it and think about, and I think it's happening. I think we saw that in a lot of the data points of thinking about how can we get ahead of this, how can we get devices secured before the major incidents start to happen, or before major exploits are detected. And I think the hackers themselves are actually starting to shift to mobile to some extent. We see more and more vulnerabilities being discovered by security researchers, by organizations such as Lookout. We see more and more focus on particularly certain types of devices, higher end devices, operating systems. Hackers go where the money is, and they know that higher end smartphones are probably being used by executives, very important VIPs, and they're more and more being targeted with some of the exploits we talked about: mobile phishing, mobile SMS, malicious SMS, that type of thing. So yeah, but I think getting back to the main question, I think it's really been that divide between the operational and security teams, prizes. It's kind of led to sort of that disparity in focus on mobile security.
Great, thank you. The next question is, do you feel that MTM and EMM are the new gold standard?
Gold standard, I don't know if to that extent, it's definitely something, it's definitely a trend. Obviously our data shows a strong connection between deployment of those two types of technologies. And we talked to a lot of end users, we talked to a lot of enterprises, and I do think that it is becoming, there's been a realization, I think, over the last maybe 3 to 5 years, as the EMM market, as EMM and MDM platforms have grown, and really, a majority of organizations now have some kind of technology in place. And as the penetration of that gets deeper into enterprises, more devices coming under management, I think there has been somewhat of a realization that technology, at its core, is a management platform. It's not a security platform. Although there are many security functions within EMM, VPN, a lot of encryption, certificate management. There's a lot of security functionality underlying EMM, but at the end of the day, it's not a active threat seeking type of technology. So, and what I think is also happening to some extent, kind of getting back to the last point I was talking about, the teams that manage end user computing from all perspectives, from mobile and PC, those are actually starting to come together over the last years. We've seen a lot of, we have survey data that show people are consolidating teams. So now more and more enterprises have an end user computing group responsible for phones and PCs, and that means they're also responsible for phone and PC security. So they're starting to think and share really best practices and approaches that way. So, and I think overall, EMM being kind of the control point for getting software deployed and pushed down to mobile devices kind of has a key role, right? Because getting to download a security app onto their phone is probably more difficult than if the security app was just there when they got the phone from corporate and booted and turned it on. So yeah, I think going forward, those two technologies are going to be kind of a 1-2 punch, or maybe not gold standard, but definitely a common way to sort of have that defense in depth approach to mobile security.
Great, thank you. Lastly, what advice do you have for our participants today looking to implement an MTM solution?
I think, definitely look at the market, look at the competitive space. Evaluations are key, thinking about what features, what functions are most important to your organization. Are you talking about, are you defending and looking to secure a mobile workforce that's knowledge workers, or is it more frontline task workers? Thinking about what are going to be the most common applications that might be at risk is one place to start. Also, I think working with integration partners, solutions who have multiple pieces of the technology, multiple pieces of the puzzle that know, what the integration points are, how well will one EMM platform integrate and operate with a certain MTM platform is important. Both of these technologies are relatively young, I think, from an overall perspective. So it's a very fast-moving market. I mean, there's new partnerships, there's new EM deals, there's new even acquisitions. We've seen acquisitions in the market over the last several years in the space. So it's that organizations need to sort of keep on top of trusted partners. I think integrators, security solution advisors, those types of folks. But I think it really comes down to thinking about the use cases of the mobile endpoints, thinking about what type of data and the risk factor, or for the levels of risk that they're comfortable with in terms of what types of data mobile devices are touching, and then thinking about deploying the security technology. Maybe to start out, let's focus on that group of sort of at or high risk or high value endpoints, and then think about going from there to a broader sort of deployment strategy.
Great advice, thank you. To learn more about what Phil and his team are working on, copy the URL to download your complimentary copy of the Mobile Threat Management MarketScape. I'd like to thank Phil Hotchmuth, our guest today, the Program Director on IDC's Enterprise Mobility team. Thank you all for tuning in. Have a good day.